Aristotle has a motto, ton legetai polakos, being is said in many ways. So he starts from where Plato left off. He says that you have to distinguish several meanings of the verb to be. And by saying the verb to be, he really means the flexed form, the is, the copula that connects the subject and the predicate. I mean, he's explicit about that in the fifth book of his Metaphysics, chapter 7, that's explicitly dedicated to the verb, to being, to on. Metaphysics Delta, the fifth book of the Metaphysics, is some sort of philosophical dictionary where Aristotle expands the meanings of several words that he is going to use later on in his treatise, talking about being, qua being, in fact, so talking about ton, heon, being in general, which is the object of metaphysics, at least according to book Gamma of his Metaphysics. Now, when he talks about being, Aristotle says that you can have either being per accidens, so coincidentally, by accident, or being per se. Now, being per accidens is what has been called in the scholarly literature accidental predication. So whenever I say the cultivated is pale, so I'm talking about a concrete person, say John, Mary, so forth, who are at the same time cultivated and pale, or seated, or standing, and so forth. So the conjunction of being cultivated and being pale, or seated, and so forth is coincidental. It is possible to say, to utter such predications, and this predication would be true precisely because there is a subject underneath that has both properties. But that's being per accidens. So it's not the being that we should focus on when we do episteme, when we pursue scientific knowledge. When we talk about being per se, Aristotle says that we can understand being in three ways. The first way is according to the categories, the second way is according to potentiality and actuality, and the third way is according to truth. Now, the third way is probably what connects us to the previous discussion, the previous videos, because whenever I say that the cup is on the table, I'm actually stating that it is true that the cup is on the table. Now, let us talk about potentiality and actuality, because that is probably the outcome of Aristotle's reflection on certain fallacies, in particular the fallacies of composition and division. Aristotle talks about fallacies in the Sophistical Refutations, which are the last book of the Organon, his works on logic, and they are in a way the counterpart of Plato's Euthydemus. But while Plato is a great artist, and so he has a performance where he ridicules the several types of fallacies that the sophists were practicing, Aristotle is more of a scientist, and so he classifies all these types of fallacies, and he discusses them and tries to solve these types of arguments and to show where they are missing the point. Now, when do we have the so-called fallacy of composition and division? Well, it can happen in different occurrences, but what is relevant for us is, for example, whenever we say something like the surface out there that is white can be red. Now, suppose the surface, like say the wall of this room, that is uniformly colored and its color is white. Well, if it is uniformly colored white, it cannot be red at the same time, precisely because colors are incompatible with each other. And we are presupposing that the surface is uniformly colored. But it is possible, of course, to change color of the surface. So, in a sense, it is true to say that the white wall can be red because it can be changed into red. And in another sense, it is not true to say that the white wall can be red because what is white cannot be at the same time red. So here we have the fallacy of composition and division. In a compound sense, it is impossible to say that the same surface is white and red. In a divided sense, you can say that what is currently white can be later on red. This brings us to distinguish two different meanings of the copula. You can say that the wall, which is currently white, is potentially red, so you would have a meaning of the copula signifying potentiality, and you would have another meaning signifying actuality. So the wall, which is currently white, is actually white. this distinction between two senses of the copula helps Aristotle also talking about motion, which he does, especially in the physics. Now let us move on to the first of the meaning per se. Aristotle says that you can have 10 different categories because you have 10 different ways of predicating a predicate of a subject. Now the first is the category of substance, which more or less correspond to that speculative predication of Parmenides that we talked about earlier on. So whenever I say Fido is a dog and a dog is an animal that is endowed with such and such property, I am describing what Fido is and what a dog is, and so I am expanding the essence, the very what it is of the dog or of Fido. So that's the category of substance. But then I have 10 more categories that expand accidental properties of things. So for example, the dog can be seated, can be barking, can be running, can be tall, can be heavy, can be light, can be placed in the market, can be at home. So you have the category also place. Can be next to another dog, so you have the category of situs, so of location as compared to other places. And all these categories are distinguished, again, based on Aristotle's reflection on fallacies. And this is the angle that my project has taken. Now, there is, there are libraries probably even larger than the one I'm sitting in right now, filled with books trying to that have as the purpose to expand Aristotle's doctrine of the categories. And I cannot even claim to have read them all, of course. But I think that there is a little angle that needs still to be expanded, and it's the following one. As we said, the distinction between is actually and is potentially is the outcome of Aristotle's reflection on the fallacy of composition and division. Now, Aristotle also talks about other fallacies, the fallacy that are pertaining to the noun that is employed in a dialectical exchange, also in the sophistical refutation, and he explicitly mentions Zeno's arguments on being, on the fact that being is one. Zeno was a pupil of Parmenides, and presumably he was having similar argument to Parmenides' ones. And Aristotle says that also these arguments are fallacious because they do not distinguish the many senses of being. Now, what happens when you cannot distinguish the many senses of beings? Well, you end up developing arguments that have the following structure. Think of a syllogism of this form. St. Peter and St. John are apostles. The apostles are 12. Therefore, St. Peter and St. John's are 12. Now, here Aristotle would say that the argument is formally valid. It's a barbarous syllogism, so no issue with that. Take the two premises, they are true. We take them to be true. Now, the only option we are left in order to explain why we arrive at the wrong conclusion, the apostles, Peter and John are 12, is because one of the terms used in the premises is used according to different meanings. Now, which is the middle term? Apostle. Apostle is used with the same meaning in the major and the minor premise. Peter and John are apostles. The apostles are 12. Therefore, it cannot be apostle, i.e. the middle term. The reason why we have a fallacy, we have a bad argument. Which other term is shared in both premises? Well, this other term is are, is the copula again, is the flexed form of the verb to be. Hence, Aristotle arrives at the necessity of distinguishing a copula that signifies quality. Peter and John are apostles, i.e. they are endowed with the quality of being apostles, and a copula that signifies quantity. The apostles are 12. By distinguishing these two meanings of the copula, you see how you cannot have any inference from premises of this sort. And at the same time, you have distinguished two meanings of the verb to be, and you have identified two ways of predicating a predicate of a subject. Hence, you have distinguished 2 categories. Now, if you iterate this operation, you get to 10 categories, or so Aristotle thought. Thank you.